4 minutes. That's all the time Iran's air arm gets over the Strait of Hormuz before the math catches up with them. 4 minutes from radar lock to wreckage trailing smoke toward the Iranian coast. And in those 4 minutes, every miscalculation the Air Force has been making for 30 years compresses into a single irreversible decision. It begins before sunrise. On a coastal strip near Bandar Abbas, ground crews pull covers off an aircraft that belongs to another century, an Iranian F-14 Tomcat, the same airframe American engineers designed for the U.S. Navy in the early 1970s, sold to the Shah before the revolution, and kept flying by a country that has been sanctioned out of every spare parts market on Earth. The jet screams off the runway and climbs hard over the Gulf, and somewhere in the cockpit a pilot makes the decision that will define the next 4 minutes of his life. The ground crew that launched this aircraft has been up since midnight. Pre-flight on an Iranian F-14 is not the streamlined choreography you see at a Western airbase. It's a negotiation, a careful walk-around in the dark with flashlights, checking hydraulic lines repaired with materials they were never designed for, inspecting engine inlets on turbofans that haven't seen factory-certified maintenance in decades. The crew chief signs off on the jet not because it's airworthy by any objective standard, but because the order has come down and the alternative is not reporting to work at all. There's a particular kind of courage in that ground crew, a courage that has nothing to do with combat and everything to do with necessity. 30 miles to the south, over the mouth of the strait, a U.S. Navy FC-18 Super Hornet is running a standard patrol track. The pilot is calm. The mission is routine. Then the radar warning receiver lights up, a fire control radar, Iranian airborne, locked onto him. The dare has been thrown. But here's what the Iranian pilot cannot see from his cockpit. He just locked onto the wrong jet, in the wrong airspace, on the wrong day. And somewhere above the carrier strike group, the machinery that will answer that dare is already moving. To understand what's actually happening in this airspace, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz is. Not as a geographic feature, but as a pressure point the entire global economy runs through. At its narrowest, this channel is barely 21 miles wide. Through it passes roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil, crude from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, all of it funneling through a gap you can almost throw a stone across on a clear day. The tanker lanes are tight, the sight lines are short, and every nautical mile of that water is contested airspace. The United States has maintained a continuous naval presence in the Persian Gulf since 1949. That presence today means a carrier strike group, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, escorted by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and a logistics train that keeps the whole formation at sea for months. When that strike group is on station in the Gulf of Oman, it puts dozens of aircraft over the region every single day. FC-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare, E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, and the MQ-9 Reapers that patrol above everything else, feeding real-time intelligence down to the strike group's Combat Information Center. Iran has none of that. What Iran has is a collection of aging airframes kept flying through ingenuity, scavenged parts, and a maintenance culture that has had to substitute creativity for supply chains. The F-14 Tomcat was the crown jewel of the Imperial Iranian Air Force, delivered in the 1970s, operated in the 1980s against Iraqi MiG-23s and Mirage F-1s during a war that consumed most of Iran's experienced aviators. After the revolution, after the sanctions, after decades without factory support from Grumman or any Western supplier, the Iranian F-14 fleet has shrunk to a shadow. The exact number of flyable airframes is classified, but analysts tracking Iranian Air Force exercises put the operationally ready Tomcat count somewhere between 10 and 20 jets, and that estimate may be generous. Each one that flies is irreplaceable. Each one that doesn't come back is a capability Iran cannot recover. The pilot climbing out of Bandar Abbas knows this. He knows the odds. He also knows the orders. What's striking about this scenario, and it has played out in variations across the Gulf for years, is not the aggression itself. It's the calculation behind it. The IRGC Air Force doesn't send F-14s over the strait expecting to win a sustained engagement. What they're testing is something subtler. Whether the United States will blink, whether the rules of engagement are tight enough to give them a window, whether a radar lock can be held long enough to send a political message without triggering a kinetic response. It's coercion through proximity. And on this morning, the pilot has convinced himself that the geometry is in his favor. It's not. Here's what the Super Hornet pilot sees in the first seconds after the radar warning receiver fires. A contact bearing northeast closings, fire control radar active. The lock is hard, not a search sweep, not an intercept geometry probe. The Iranian pilot has committed. He's crossed the line between intimidation and targeting, and that changes everything. The Super Hornet pilot doesn't hesitate. He brakes right, hard. A maximum rate defensive turn that dumps the lock geometry forces the F-14's radar to reacquire and buys seconds. In an air-to-air engagement, seconds are the currency that determines who goes home. The defensive turn is textbook. Energy management, angles game, deny the bandit the straight-line solution he needs to build a firing solution. The Super Hornet is a third-generation evolution beyond anything the Iranian pilot is flying. Its flight control computers are managing the turn automatically, optimizing angle of attack, keeping the pilot on the edge of the performance envelope without departing controlled flight. The F-14 Tomcat, even in its prime, couldn't match that, and this F-14 is not in its prime. What the Iranian pilot doesn't know, what he cannot know from his radar scope, is that he's not fighting one FCA-18. He's fighting two. The carrier's combat air patrol had a second Super Hornet on station 12 miles to the west, running a parallel track at higher altitude. The moment the first pilot's radar warning receiver fired, that second aircraft was already turning. The E-2D Hawkeye, orbiting at altitude with its rotating radar dome, has the whole picture, both FC-18s, the F-14, the surface picture below. The tactical air controller aboard the Hawkeye is calling vectors. The second Super Hornet is accelerating, coming in from an angle the F-14's crew can't effectively cover, with full situational awareness piped in from the Hawkeye's data link. The F-14's radar intercept officer, the guy in the back seat responsible for the AWG-9 radar system, is working the problem. He knows they've lost the lock on the first Super Hornet. He knows there's a second contact to the west. He knows the geometry is deteriorating. What he doesn't know is how fast. Going through open-source analysis of IRGC Air Force doctrine, one detail keeps coming back. Iranian pilots in these confrontations consistently underestimate the response time of carrier-based combat air patrol. The assumption, baked into their training, is that a single jet over the strait is a single problem. It's never a single problem. The carrier's combat air patrol exists precisely to ensure that no hostile aircraft ever faces a lone American jet. The 4-minute clock is running. At minute 1, the first Super Hornet has broken the lock and is turning back toward the threat, positioning for an offensive geometry of its own. The F-14 crew is reacquiring. The AWG-9 radar on the Tomcat is a capable system when it works. But decades of deferred maintenance and improvised repair mean Iranian AWG-9s operate at degraded performance. Detection range is shorter than design spec. The tracking algorithms run on hardware that has been patched and repatched by Iranian engineers, working without original documentation. At minute 2, the second Super Hornet is inside firing range. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface until you understand the physics. The AIM-120 AMRAAM, the Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile, is an active radar homing weapon. Once it's off the rail, it guides itself. The launching aircraft doesn't need to maintain a lock. It doesn't need to fly toward the target. The missile does the work. The second Super Hornet fires from a position the F-14 crew isn't even fully tracking, and the AIM-120 accelerates toward the Tomcat at better than Mach 4. The F-14 crew gets the missile warning. They have seconds to react. What would you have called from that cockpit? Break into the missile and accept a turning fight against two Super Hornets with full situational awareness? Dive for the deck and try to drag the engagement into low altitude where radar clutter might help? Or push the throttles forward and try to close the range fast enough that the AIM-120's kinematics work against it? Every option leads to the same coast. At minute 3, the F-14 executes a brake turn and deploys chaff, aluminum strips that bloom on the radar. Screen, designed to confuse an incoming missile's seeker head. Against older radar homing missiles, chaff works. Against the AIM-120's modern seeker, which combines inertial mid-course guidance with a terminal active radar phase, chaff is a complication, not a solution. The missile adjusts. It has its own radar now. It's not fooled. In the backseat of the Tomcat, the radar intercept officer is calling out the missile track. His voice is controlled, the product of training that is rehearsed exactly this moment, even if his Air Force never expected to actually face it at this range against this weapon. He's feeding countermeasure inputs, calling angles, doing everything the syllabus taught him. The problem is the syllabus was written around a threat environment that no longer exists. The Iranian Air Force trained its RIOs to defeat AIM-7 Sparrows and early AIM-54 Phoenix variants. The weapons the Americans were carrying when these procedures were written before the revolution, when Iranian and American aviators were on the same side. The AIM-120 is a different problem entirely. The terminal guidance phase is faster, the seeker is harder to deceive, and the engagement geometry the RIO is trying to manipulate has already closed past the point where any of his options buy meaningful time. The pilot knows it too. He can feel it in the aircraft's responses. The airframe isn't crisp the way it was when these jets were new. There's a half second of lag in the roll that shouldn't be there, a vibration in the port engine that has been there for 3 flights, documented and deferred because there was nothing to fix it with. An aircraft is an honest machine. It tells you exactly what it is. And what this one is telling him at minute 3 over the Strait of Hormuz is that it has given everything it has. Minute 4. The AIM-120 reaches the F-14. The detonation is not cinematic. There's no slow-motion fireball visible from the carrier deck. The engagement happening 30 miles from the nearest ship, and the altitude and geometry mean the flash is brief and distant. What the E-2D Hawkeye sees on its radar is a contact that was tracking and maneuvering suddenly go ballistic, no longer flying, no longer turning, describing the arc of falling metal toward the Iranian coast. The MQ-9 Reaper orbiting above the engagement zone captures it on electro-optical sensors, a streak of debris, a thin smoke trail, the wreckage descending toward the shallows northwest of Bandar Abbas. The radar warning receiver in the first Super Hornet goes quiet. The lock is gone, not because the Iranian pilot chose to disengage, but because the aircraft generating the lock no longer exists. The E-2D Hawkeye immediately begins scanning for additional threats. Are there other aircraft lifting off from Iranian coastal fields? Are surface-to-air missile systems lighting up in response? The answers come back in seconds. No. The air defense network is not escalating. Whatever mission the F-14 was flying, the command decision on the Iranian side is to absorb the loss and not widen the engagement. The patrol line over Hormuz holds. The tanker traffic below it doesn't divert. The strait is open. Back at Bandar Abbas, at some point in the hours after the engagement, a ground crew that launched one aircraft receives the data that tells them it isn't coming back. There's no dramatic announcement, no klaxon, no formation of officers walking across the tarmac. It's quieter than that. A radio call, a notation in a log, a crew chief who does the arithmetic himself when the estimated recovery time passes without a contact on approach. He's seen this before. Not often, but he knows what the silence means. The loss of an Iranian F-14 Tomcat is not a logistical event, it's a strategic one. Iran cannot build F-14s. Iran cannot buy F-14s. Iran cannot source the titanium airframe components, the AWG-9 radar subassemblies, the TF-30 engine parts that keep these jets flying. Every airframe lost reduces the fleet by a number that cannot be replaced. The pilot, whatever his rank, whatever his experience, represents years of investment in an air force that has no pipeline to draw replacements from the same generation of fighter aviation. The IRGC air arm gains nothing from this engagement. The patrol line it was challenging is unchanged. The carrier strike group operating south of the strait is undisturbed. The Super Hornets that answered the lock are back on deck, being refueled and rearmed. The E-2D Hawkeye is still on station. The Reaper is still circling. The machinery of American naval aviation doesn't notice the absence of one Iranian Tomcat the way the IRGC notices it. Here's the read on this. The F-14 lock over Hormuz was not a military operation. It was a political signal, a way for the IRGC to demonstrate to its own chain of command and to the region that it still contests American airspace above the strait. The problem with political signals delivered by aging combat aircraft against a carrier air wing is that the other side has the right to answer, kinetically, and when they do, the political signal becomes a political disaster. You've spent a missile. The Americans have spent a missile. The difference is they can afford another 1,000, and you cannot afford another Tomcat. Most people assume Iran's willingness to challenge American aircraft over Hormuz reflects genuine confidence in their air combat capability. The evidence tells a different story. These engagements, the radar locks, the close passes, the aggressive intercepts, are theater for a domestic audience and a regional one. The IRGC knows it cannot fight and win a sustained air campaign against a carrier air wing. What it's trying to do is establish a pattern of defiance that stops short of the threshold that triggers a comprehensive American response. The F-14 lock on the Super Hornet is calibrated to be deniable, a radar emission, a close approach, technically aggressive but not a fired weapon. The calculation assumes the American response will be proportionate and bounded. A warning transmission, maybe a reciprocal intercept, a diplomatic protest. The calculation fails when the American response is an AIM-120 and a Hawkeye that has already deconflicted the airspace. Here's the unpopular take, and we'll say it plainly. The destruction of that F-14 was the most honest communication the United States could send to Tehran about the rules over Hormuz. Every diplomatic note, every freedom of navigation assertion, every carefully worded statement from the Pentagon about the right to operate in international airspace. None of it carries the of an AIM-120 that reaches a hostile radar lock before the lock can be completed. The Iranian pilot who made the decision to go to fire control, to snap that lock, onto a U.S. Navy aircraft, needed to understand what the answer would be. Now, the IRGC force understands it in a way that no day march through the Swiss embassy could convey. The question worth asking is not whether the response was proportionate. It was. The question is what the IRGC does next. They have options, none of them good. They can escalate in the air, send more jets, accept more losses, and watch the fleet shrink faster than it already is. They can escalate below, fast boats in the strait, harassment of tanker traffic, the kind of surface provocation the IRGC Revolutionary Guard Navy has been running for years. Or they can absorb this loss, say nothing publicly that admits a Tomcat went down over the strait, and recalculate the cost of the next radar lock. History suggests the third option. The IRGC has a high tolerance for absorbing losses it doesn't have to explain to its public. a pilot and an airframe that disappeared on a training flight over the Gulf. That's the kind of story that gets buried in a country that controls its own information environment. But the loss is real, and the commanders who know what happened know that the next Tomcat that lifts off toward the Strait does so with the complete understanding that an AIM-120 is patient and an E-2D Hawkeye sees everything. There's a detail that has stayed with me looking at this kind of engagement. The asymmetry is not just in hardware, it's in doctrine. The United States Navy has been training for exactly this scenario, a hostile radar lock from a legacy fighter over a contested strait since the 1980s. The tactics the Super Hornet pilot executed are not improvised. They're rehearsed, drilled, refined through generations of adversarial training at NAS Fallon, embedded in the muscle memory of every fleet aviator before they ever fly a combat patrol. The Iranian pilot, flying an airframe designed in 1969 with radar systems maintained by a country under comprehensive sanctions, is improvising against a system that doesn't improvise. The 4 minutes over Hormuz are the product of 30 years of diverging investment. The United States spent those 30 years building the FCA-18 Super Hornet, the AIM-120, the E-2D Hawkeye, the MQ-9 Reaper, and the doctrine that integrates all of them into a single networked engagement. Iran spent those 30 years keeping the F-14 alive on ingenuity and spare parts cannibalized from jets that could no longer fly. The outcome of that investment divergence is not 4 minutes of drama over the Strait. It's the permanent structural impossibility of Iran winning an air engagement against a carrier air wing. Here's what this engagement tells us about deterrence in the Gulf. It works. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the occasional miscalculation that sends an aircraft into the water. But the carrier strike group on station south of Hormuz exists to make exactly this calculation, that the cost of challenging American airspace is prohibitive, that the IRGC air arm cannot sustain the attrition, and that the strait stays open. Every tanker that passes through undisturbed is deterrence operating as designed. The MQ-9 Reaper circling above the engagement zone has already transmitted the full sensor package back to the strike group's intelligence section. Before the debris from the F-14 hits the water, the electro-optical footage, the radar track, the intercept geometry, all of it is being analyzed in real time. Not for the press release, which will be carefully worded and strategically vague, for the next engagement, for the targeting package, for the understanding of exactly how the IRGC Air Force responds when one of its F-14s doesn't come home. Down in the carrier's Combat Information Center, 2 decks below the flight deck and insulated from the sounds of the sea, the watch team is running the debrief in parallel with the ongoing patrol picture. The tactical action officer is walking through the timeline on a large display. The moment of radar lock, the first defensive break, the vector call from the Hawkeye, the firing solution, the impact. Every second of the engagement has a timestamp. Every decision is logged. This is not bureaucracy. It's the institutional memory that keeps the next engagement from producing a different outcome. The carrier doesn't forget. The carrier learns. What the intelligence tells the strike group commander is already clear from the sensor data. The IRGC didn't scramble additional aircraft. The coastal air defense batteries didn't light up. The fast boat swarms in the strait didn't surge. The Iranian response to losing a Tomcat over the strait is to absorb the loss quietly. That tells you everything about the actual correlation of forces. When you have the real advantage, you escalate. When you're absorbing a lesson, you go quiet. The E-2D Hawkeye holds its patrol station above the strait for another 6 hours. No Iranian aircraft lift off from Bandar Abbas or any of the coastal strips along the northern Gulf Coast. The airspace the F-14 tried to contest at 0400, tried to contest with a radar lock and a dare, is unchanged. The patrol line is unchanged. The tanker traffic through the strait resumes its normal cadence as the morning shipping lanes open. The world doesn't know that anything happened over the strait before sunrise. The oil keeps moving. Patrol line over Hormuz never bends. One question deserves to be asked honestly before we close this out. Is the IRGC Air Force getting the message? Because the radar locks have happened before. The close passes have happened before. The aggressive intercepts that stop just short of a fired weapon have happened repeatedly across 30 years of American naval presence in the Gulf, and yet the F-14s keep lifting off. The fast boats keep surging. The provocation keep coming, calculated to stay below the threshold that triggers a comprehensive response. The answer is probably yes, and also no. The commanders who understand the actual correlation of forces understand the message. The pilots who volunteer for these missions understand the message. But the IRGC is not a monolith, and the political logic of defiance runs alongside the military logic of survival. The regime needs to demonstrate to its domestic audience and its regional proxies that it contests American power, that it doesn't simply yield, that there is a cost to operating in waters the IRG considers within its sphere. The F-14 that lifts off knowing the odds is not a military instrument. It's a political one. The AIM-120 that answers it does not make political distinctions. Here's the bottom line from the strait. on a morning when an aging jet went looking for a confrontation and found one. The United States Navy doesn't hold the Strait of Hormuz by the grace of Iran's restraint. It holds it because a carrier air wing puts dozens of sorties over the Gulf every day, because an E-2D Hawkeye sees the airspace from horizon to horizon, because an AIM 2020 travels at Mach 4 and does not negotiate, and because the doctrine that integrates all of those pieces has been refined over 30 years to produce exactly this outcome. The F-14 Tomcat that climbed out of Bandar Abbas before dawn had one window: break the lock and disengage before the second Super Hornet came around, and live to fly another day. Press the lock and accept the engagement, and accept the arithmetic of what a networked carrier air wing does to a single legacy fighter. Both roads in the end led to the same coast. What would you have called from that cockpit? Not the bravado answer, the actual answer, with the missile warning screaming in your headset and 2 Super Hornets on the radar scope and an AIM 120 already in the air. Comment below. We read everyone. And if you want to understand how the surface picture below that engagement works, how the Berg fast boat swarms have tested Arleigh Burke destroyers in the same waters, and what those destroyers carry for exactly that problem, that story is next. The Strait does not only run its challenges in the air. Subscribe and stay with us.